So I call this presentation on the United States and China relationship, two nations under God, indivisible. As I talk about the relationship between these two countries, you'll find that it is extremely complex, if not the most complex relationship this world has ever seen. You would not believe the amount of conflict and division and cooperation and economic dependence and political and military conflict and dependence. So let's get going. Now, between China and the United States, there are actually no joint military operations being conducted. In fact, the militaries are quite in conflict with each other overall. No extreme hint of war, um, but very different military goals. Nuclear capabilities. China currently has 500 warheads, and thankfully they've signed a while back and committed to a what we call the NFU, the non-first or the no first use policy, committing to never using or being the first to use nuclear weapons on another country. That came and is supported through the non-proliferation treaty that a lot of countries are part of. The United States, on the other hand, has a lot more nuclear warheads and missiles, 5,800 about, um, and has a similar policy on nuclear use or nuclear weapon use, but really has committed to saying we will never use nuclear weapons unless it is for the purpose of deterring other countries from continuing to use nuclear weapons. If other countries use nuclear weapons on us, or there is an imminent threat of nuclear weapon use, the United States will employ their nuclear warheads. Probably the biggest threat, though, with China specifically, is cybersecurity. The United States and China have an ongoing battle between hacking, cybersecurity, stealing information, technology, um, intellectual property. Now, China, I would say, I mean, we can't say exactly, but I would say China was the leading cause that um, committed the United States to a more offensive strategy as opposed to a defensive strategy. As of right now, the United States employs roughly 70 or more cybersecurity teams to not just defend against cybersecurity attacks from China and Russia and other nations, um, but to go hunt for malware. Their policy is we're not going to succeed um, by dwelling on a previous war. We are going to succeed by planning for the next war. And so the United States has transitioned from a more of a defensive standpoint to an offensive standpoint. Quick, quick graphic for you on the nations around the world that maintain nuclear warheads. I won't go on about this, but kind of interesting how many there are around the world, and surprisingly how little there are. Um, Maybe not surprising, they're very expensive and difficult to make. Now, one of the main sources of conflict between the United States that reached its height and maybe peak in 2022 is the conflict with Taiwan. Quick bit of history. Back in 1972, there was what we call the Shanghai Communique. That was Nixon's pronunciation, or I guess declaration, that it would recognize a one China policy under the conditions that we would support a peaceful resolve between China and Taiwan. Now, that occurred because the original governing body in China was overcome and had to flee to Taiwan from mainland China, and acted and was recognized by the United States government as um, the governing body of China. As years progressed, the United States transitioned to recognizing the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as the central government. 1979, the second communique. This was an official recognition of the PRC as the central government of China, emphasized the one China policy and the United States' willingness to adhere to that policy, but under the condition of there has to be peaceful resolve between your differences. Taiwan and China. Third communique with Ronald Reagan, 1982. This reduces arms sales to Taiwan because the United States, what a weird relationship, consistently treated Taiwan as a sovereign nation, but still China. So the United States commits to reduce its arms sales reductions, or sorry, to reduce its arms sales to Taiwan under or predicated upon China's commitment to resolve China and Taiwan differences peacefully. Now, here's the thing. Recently, for several years, China has been very aggressive in its actions, its military actions, its threats towards Taiwan in order to coerce Taiwan and absorb it back into mainland China to delineate or to get rid of the differences between Taiwan and China because Taiwan is an incredibly um, plays an incredibly active role in the production of technology and the world economy. So many countries are dependent upon Taiwan for the reason that they produce the world's largest producer of semiconductors, which is used in all modern technology, communication, um, anything like that. So, with Taiwan and China, the United States, between Taiwan and China, there is the Taiwan Strait, um, which is a massive and important um, strait um, for trade, commerce, economic cooperation. Um, and so the US really wants to maintain that open. Recently, you've had Germany, you've had the United States and other countries um, sail warships and destroyers through this Taiwan Strait in response to China's aggressive behavior towards Taiwan in order to show that we're not willing to let China take control or overly impose their influence in that region because of the the economic importance, the political importance of the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the East China Sea. Despite these conflicts, I just want you to see the United States and China are working together in a variety of treaties. There are more than this. These are just some of the main ones. Treaties are a massive part of the United States and China relationship. We can't just say that Chinese US relationship is bad. It's all bad. It's not. There's a lot of unification. Um, and so treaties are a lifesaver for the relationship between these two countries. But China does feel as though the United States and other US allies are practicing what we call containment policies that are a threat to China. Instead of helping China to promote their growth, their economic, political, military progression, the United States is creating these, in the eyes of China, um, coalitions to contain China and to stop them, to beat them down, if you'd say. One of these that China sees as a threat is what we call the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue: Japan, Australia, US, and India. This is more to focus on security cooperation, economic infrastructure, um, and to provide an alternative to China's BRI or the Belt Road Initiative. This could be considered like the modern Silk Road. China's trying to create this economic and political and physical connection between continents, between countries and nations, to spread their influence and really connect the world economically. Another organization or treaty or coalition is the IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This involves countries like Australia, Fiji, India, Indonesia. Um, this is kind of like the economic mirror of the Quad. 14 countries all come together in this coalition, and those 14 countries represent 40% of the global GDP. So China feels like these, and in essence, they are created to counteract China's and that coalition with China, their ability to overcome and take over economically. The IPEF focuses on trade, supply chains, clean energy, tax and anti-corruption. So a very important checks, what we call a check and balance between the U.S. and Russia. But it's just important to note that one reason China is so adamant um, is because they do feel like I say adamant, I mean maybe anti-Western in a lot of areas or some areas, is because it feels like Western civilization is holding it down or containing it or beating it down in its progression, in its progression. Now, why is this relationship so um, complex? Why is the US so dependent on China, so scared of that dependence? Why is China wanting to um, grow so much? Well, look at this. Rare earth minerals. China produces 60% of all rare earth components, um, controls 80% of the global supply of those rare earth components. Um, Not just in harvesting those rare earth minerals, but China controls the refining capacity, 80% of the refining capacity of those rare earth minerals. Now, that is a massive dependence that the US has upon China. From 2014 to 17, 80% of our rare earth imports, such as silicon, I think I mean, there's so many different metals, electronic components that the US imported. 80% of those were from China on its own. As the US strives to be more clean, more green, we depend on China for things like batteries and solar panels. One thing China is doing to establish an economic arm in the world is investing in ports. They don't want to just be economically involved in imports and exports. They want to have a foothold at in the ports, um, to have a say in what goes in and out, to have a say in the economies of the world. You can just see that China is truly investing in a lot in order to gain its foothold. Now, while China feels that the U.S. is anti-China or pro-China containment, China is blatantly anti-U.S. In a large sphere in the economy. To combat this containment vision or perspective, China has created what we call the SCO and the BRICS, or the BRICS, which are some very non-Western and we could say anti-Western partnerships. If I were to read you or tell you some of these countries, you'd see the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China, India, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Russia. Just from those first countries, you can see that these are very anti-Western, sentiment-focused nations. The SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is kind of like the Quad. It's the counterpart of the Quad that I mentioned to you before, or the IPF. The BRICS that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now you'll notice that India is involved in multiple pro-China and pro-US treaties or coalitions. It's really interesting that China and the US are fighting for the cooperation, support, and dedication of these countries. Now, I guess the overall goal of these non-Western partnerships are to establish China as the main economic, um, I guess, partner in these coalitions. One thing that this strives to do is decrease the value of the dollar in international trade, making it so the dollar is no longer the world standard, and increasing the value of the renminbi. As China tries to decouple or separate itself from U.S. dependence, one of its main goals is to increase the value of its currency internationally. Right now, this is a threat for sure. It's more of a concept than a reality, I would say. But if the United States doesn't counteract that and increase the value of the dollar or strive to maintain that value, um, you might see a large shift in the economic power of China. Now, tariffs. Tariffs are a major part of the US-China relationship, and often a very good deterrent strategy, but often one thing that increases and heightens tensions between these two nations. Trump was a major supporter of tariffs, um, whether you want to call that inspired, erratic, um, whatever you want. I won't take a position on this. But 2018, $50 billion tariff. 2019, $200 billion tariff. Finally, as the election cycle nears, China is and the U.S. are mending some economic relationships um, with that arose from different needs in the world. But 2024, we realize the United States needs to do something as it decouples with China slowly. And so Biden imposed more tariffs on Chinese vehicles and green products and those imports. And so a lot of scholars and economic professionals will say, should the US become pro-tariff? The answer for a lot of people is no, mainly because of this. The United States wants to be zero emissions by a specific day. A lot of companies want to be zero emission. If that goal is our main priority, that is an impossible goal to reach without the help and interaction of China. Now, if we do decouple with China and become very pro-tariff, that just extends those goals out to the future, makes them more unattainable. The Chamber of Commerce said that half of the U.S. investment, or if half of the U.S. investment in China were abandoned through tariffs or just increased decoupling, it would cost American companies $25 billion every single year in lost profits, plus $500 billion to the U.S. gross GDP or gross domestic product. So big things to consider when we're trying to separate ourselves from China or impose tariffs on China. One way to counteract Chinese influence and our economic dependence is what we call the CHIPS Act the United States has implemented. Um, if you look, 60% of what China, or sorry, 60% of the world's supply of semiconductors come from Taiwan alone, um, governed overall by China, and 90% of the most advanced chips in AI and all types of technology, those come from Taiwan. So the United States says, let's stop offshoring, let's bring back companies, bring back businesses, let's start to produce in the United States justifiably. So our dependence upon China is lessened. Um, and so right now it's working pretty well. There have been some proposals to adjust in the CHIPS Act, create a second and third CHIPS Act, just to um, address the needs in a changing world and a changing economy. One of the strongest connections between these two countries is their involvement and commitment to the United Nations. Um, China is in full support of expanding the United Nations Security Council. I say full support. There are obviously differing opinions, um, but there are five members of the Security Council, all have veto power when they come together to discuss and impose um, uh, I don't know what policies when it comes to the security of the world and the actions of specific nations. Now, it's been a very good system of checks and balances between the U.S. and China because it makes sure that the U.S. and China and these five countries agree on and are really doing what's at the heart of the best interests of these nations. Now, within the UN, in the General Assembly, China is becoming actually quite popular. China is saying, you know what, we want to grow, but our priority within the UN is to invest in your development, um, in your people, in and so you can see here, China is the second largest contributor to the UN, um, like a peacekeeping budget. They pay over, I think it's actually 10 billion. I think I misspoke here. Over 10 years, the U.S. is the first or the highest contributor, the largest contributor. China is contributing specifically to the World Food Program, the development program in the UN, the Peace and Development Trust Fund. China is saying, let us be a part of you. As China increases its investments, people will begin to depend on China more, see them as not just someone who is increasing their economic standing, but is being a hero to the world as well, giving China a lot more power. You can see China has a lot more representation in the UN than it used to. So their investments are smart. Their investments are production oriented, are security oriented, are peace oriented in the UN. So what do we do? Well, nobody knows, and that's the end. Just joking. I'll preface this with the fact that I'm pretty new to this world, and so my ideas on U.S.-China future relations may be limited, myopic, and very simple as I learn more. But let's get into it. Number one, the United States has to assure that in the future it has access to critical rare earth minerals, materials, and refinement capabilities, whether it's dependent on China or not. The lack of access will surely produce the downfall of the U.S. economy as we fall behind. Number two, maybe in the in the global development standpoint, especially in the global South, maybe the U.S. can come together with China and create this joint coalition, just the two of them, and say we are going to choose this country or this sector, and we are both going to invest 50-50. That way, as China and the U.S. Invest, they don't have to outcompete each other, but unify themselves in common ground. Common ground is going to be the greatest policy focus between the U.S. and China. Number three, free trade competition. Look, let capitalism and free trade balance out the competition between the U.S. and China. Let there be a system of checks and balances through our mere competition. Let the world decide, and let the United States take measures in that sense that will contribute to a stable economy and sustainability in our economy. I do want to emphasize this, a non-containment or pro-engagement policy. The U.S., for any relations to get better, the China cannot feel as though the U.S. is beating it down with a stick as opposed to giving it carrots and benefits. Containment is probably the driving perspective that drives China to outcompete and maintain anti-Western perspectives. So no matter what, the U.S. has to say, China, we are for your development, we are for your growth, we are for your sustainability and your world influence. But here's our standards. There's that sticks versus carrots. We need to balance our incentives and penalties to encourage cooperation, not to allow China to feel like we're beating it down as opposed to offering it benefits. Lastly, as I mentioned, the Trump administration and the Biden administration are imposing a variety of tariffs. Are tariffs bad? People say yes or no. We have to use some deterrent strategies, and I would say those are necessary times. But I do feel as though the United States has to be the nation that does what it says it's going to do, but that sets very clear expectations of what it's going to do. Now, the United States must play that role and be completely transparent. If we want to decrease the perspective that we are containing China, maybe we don't introduce surprise sanctions unless, and we create policies with clear expectations of our non-negotiables economically, politically, and in all these other realms, which we've already done in a lot of senses, as seen with the One China policy, but set very clear boundaries and expectations that if those are crossed, if those non-negotiables are not met, here are the sanctions we are going to impose upon China. Okay. This is what I'm so passionate about. And if I were the president, I would promote this. I would promote this mutual exchange of and cultural and educational understanding within our education system, within our diplomacy, within our, I mean, within every level of United States government, social, political life. Now, maybe we increase the amount of students that we exchange. Yes, there are national security concerns, but we can address those. We increase the amount of cultural understanding that our diplomats, our ambassadors, our politicians have. Let's learn Chinese. I'm personally right now learning Mandarin Chinese so I can understand more of Chinese culture and their political drive. Um, let's show China that we are not willing to separate ourselves from them, but more unify with them in our understanding of who they are and what they need. Let's soften their hearts, right, through understanding. Language and cultural exchanges, just mentioned that. Short-term goal when it comes to diplomacy, let's ratify treaties such as the Rome Statute, the Law of the Sea treaties. The world, especially China, cannot see the United States as a double standard nation, a nation of double standards who puts its own interests consistently above the interests of the international arena and countries. So let's ratify treaties and prove that we actually value what we say we're going to value. Let's practice the implementation, the practice of sacrifice, not just double standards and gain. Lastly, I want to propose the idea of non-risk connections. Now, there are a lot of connections that are risky to build with China, places we can't step because of its uneven ground, its dangerous ground. But there are things that China and the U.S. Are unified in regarding their interests. Number one, environment and climate change cooperations, just environment and climate change. Let's make that our foundation of our relationship, the cooperation in that realm, and then build off of that. Use that to soften the hearts of China. Number two, food security. With a massive population, that is going to be, in coming days, one of the biggest struggles. And so let's show China we are willing to give. We're willing to create a secure foundation for your people as well as ours, and let us base our policies and our relationship off of that common ground, or humanitarian work in general, disaster relief cooperation. Let's give more than we take at the time. Let's sacrifice more than we try to get gain as we try and build common ground, and let's soften the hearts of our political rivals and those who we are in competition with. There's my simple ideas. I'd love to hear comments and your suggestions, and I will keep doing deeper study to understand this complex relationship.